Feature Friday.
The freshest. Okay, this is really exciting. You guys sent this through and we immediately caught up to it. So this is the evolution of Filipino music from 1500s all the way to the 2020. So this is done by Justin J. Taller? Or Taller? Don't know. for that matter, bilingual problems.
Yeah, sorry,
Let's have a look.
sorry for the ugly set. I know some people are liking it, some people are not. This is not actually gonna be the final thing. It's just everything's been delayed and the deliveries and everything now unforeseen shit. We're working on a new channel as well. Working on a few channels actually. So bear with us. Apologies that it looks kind of shit at the moment, but let's get into the video. Go on, you go.
It'll change.
Evolution of Filipino music. We're performing as well, so this is great to know. We're performing at our first Filipino music festival, so you can get your tickets as well. And this is great to obviously know and dive deeper into the music culture of the Philippines. So let's give it a watch.
Yes, let's have a look.
Shout out Justin, man.
Justin J.
It went viral on Facebook. Everyone kept sending it to us.
Oh, it's all a cappella situation. That's so freaking cool. That's beautiful. You see? Ballads. Oh my god, can we just really have a moment for the freaking vocal freaking showdown?
Turn it up, I think you should turn it up.
That is insane.
I think it's so interesting to know that, like, in the 1950s, right? Mm-hmm. Music was so recognizable. Like, if you look back at music and you choose the 50s, it's such a recognizable sound all around the world.
Yes,
and that to me is so peculiar and bizarre because the world wasn't that interconnected back then. Traveling was very difficult, and knowing people from other countries, and it was really hard as well. So the fact that it's so, I don't know if maybe the US, because obviously there was like wars and things like that, had a lot to play with it.
Yes.
Because it does sound like very like.
It's rock and roll from the 1950s from America.
From the US, so.
Yeah, because if you think about it, even the rock and roll and the style of like the Beach Boys style of music, was popular. It wasn't very predominant in like say for example Britain.
How the fuck did it get to Asia?
It's a very good question. I think it has to do with
is it because of the wars and stuff? Because people used to tell us a lot. Like when we had Easy Mill on the podcast, he was mentioning bases. Like he would hang around and do skateboarding when he was growing up. I mean, he's only like my age, but still like 24 years ago, he was like skateboarding in these fucking US bases, where like the US Army once set down, and like at some in the northern part of the Philippines, country music, it's very very prevalent still due to the influences of the US. So it's very intriguing, and also like in South Korea you can tell the same as well.
Yes,
Japan
correct.
You can tell the same as well, like with the US, the influences of the US. So I guess it might be because of that, because the US was sort of sending troops fucking everywhere.
Yeah. I do think it must have an effect, because, for example, in Europe, even though rock and roll was the movement,
really get that in the UK.
It wasn't the predominant sound. Actually, you were coming out with a completely different style of music itself. So it's quite interesting. I would think it has something to do with
because like.
The military bases.
Older Filipino music, from our understanding, it was a lot closer to what was that song? What was the style? Kundimans, right? That was one.
And cariñosas,
Kundimans, right? That was very like prevalent in the time. So sort of like in Venezuela, in South America, a lot of the songs that were made with a much more sort of a literate purpose. They came from sort of, I guess, observations of nature, or perhaps they came from literature or poems, paintings that then was somehow translated into music, folklore, stories of folk.
Yes.
So it wasn't like an industry sort of take of things. It was just more like songs of the town, I guess.
Exactly, societal perspectives that then were popularized by word of mouth, basically.
And ways to serenade your loved
yes.
one. Ways to explain your feelings. I guess it was taking more in that, and then as sort of time progressed, of course, making money off of music is old as fuck as well.
Yes.
It's not really new. But it's interesting then to sort of see the 1950s. We just went fucking industrial.
Yeah.
Let me love you, Carmelita.
See, here you start to see. That's banging.
Hold me, hug me. Panahon na para masaya. Bakit wala problema?
Can we have a moment for how incredibly difficult it must have been to film and edit this?
It also seems quite minimalistic. Like it's got you see AirPods on.
Yeah, it's not very that crazy, but in terms of production. But this must have taken him
long
ages.
And because he's not that that big in production, he has to kind of get takes really correct.
Yes.
Because he doesn't. It seems like he doesn't have a team of people fucking editing everything. It just seems like he sort of made it for the love of it. Which shout out, man.
That's freaking crazy.
Oh, the bases.
This is really cool, man. 1970s was pumping up music.
I wish you would have put the names of some.
From mga kababayan ko, ako ay Pilipino.
I'm telling you, the 1990s came in and slapped you in the butt with a freaking good R&B situation.
Interestingly enough, so 1950s to 1990s is a time in the Filipino music industry which is the most unknown to us. Early 90s, late 90s, up until now is sort of where I guess we're starting to learn a bit more from. But 1950s and 1920s is a completely unknown
new
ground to us. But something that happened really interesting that I don't think we mentioned enough on the podcast or the channel is that from the late 90s up until early 2000s, so it's a really short period of time, there was a time where this sound became very popular because groups in the Philippines became very popular. Girl groups, most specifically. Not that familiar with the story of sort of boy pop groups, like the Backstreet Boys, or nowadays in South Korea, obviously K-pop's ginormous, and K-pop became ginormous in Korea.
In the late 90s too.
Well, not ginormous, but it became a thing in late 90s, 1996, 1997, Seoteji Boys, the lad like YG Entertainment, and then up until early 2000s, 2003, 2004, it could have disappeared, and then it really evolved. It picked up competition, the JYPs, the SM Entertainments, the YGs, picked up SM was probably the biggest competitor, and then it pushed this sort of industry, right, the K-pop industry. But in the Philippines, interestingly enough, between the early 2000s, sort of the same as in Venezuela, and late 90s, there was a lot of girl groups. I forget the names of them. A lot of them were involved in a lot of scandals because I follow Chuck, the YouTube. I'll put his, but I'll sure she'll put the actual channel because I forget his actual channel name. He does the SB19 documentaries and stuff like that.
Yeah, but he does drop a lot of cool information about Filipino music industry.
He's so underrated to me.
He is.
He really does his
such
research.
A gem.
And for people like us, which I think his content's probably targeted towards.
Chuck.
Yeah, that's right. Because we're foreigners, we don't really understand the industry that deep, but he helps. And one of the things, there was this group, I forget the name of us, you can obviously tell I'm not very good with names, but they were involved, one of them went to they went to prison at one point, and they one of them was involved in murders and shit. It was a crazy story.
What the hell?
But and they were naked a lot of the time and shit. Yeah, it was hilarious. And but there was a lot of competition I like the conflict and the controversies is like that. That's what it is. But what I find even more interesting is like they weren't the only ones. They had to do such crazy things to maintain relevancy back in the day because it was a lot harder because there's so many other groups.
Wow. Okay.
You know, and they all had names like that, like Beach Girls or things like that. And
Beach Girls.
Well, you know, fucking in the US, like Backstreet Boys, TLC.
NSYNC.
Exactly. It's like, come on, think of these, you know, these names. You know what I mean? So
they banged.
at this point in the 90s, I do understand why in places like, you know, Eastern places, you know, like Asia, would be doing things like this because they were becoming really popular in the West, and it's just smart business to sort of see what's doing well in somewhere in the world. How can we do it here? Put their own twist of the country or the industry that it would sort of perform well, and then sort of do it. But this, I'm interested in seeing this section now to see if maybe it really was that impactful in the music industry or not. Because I've just been aching to speak about this because I just learned it like a couple of weeks ago. But anyways, go on.
It is very pop forward.
It's good. For us to recognize each song, but it's super interesting to see the evolution of sort of genres, which I think is because he is doing. It's very difficult, like to try and put in a song or in a medley the 2000s and the 2020s, like those 20 years. It's so hard because you would have to mention like the huge uptake of R&B, like the Kailas, the JRs, and you'd have to take up the huge uprise of soul in the Philippines with the Jayas from the late 90s, the early 90s up the way to the early 2000s. You'll obviously have to mention these are probably the pinnacle era of Regine Velasquez in the Philippines, right?
Correct.
So this is when she's at her, I guess, physical prime, theoretically, because she still fucking bangs.
I would argue that she is better now than back then because of like there's just something that comes with
and the maturity.
There's something that comes with just experience that it can't be beaten. Like you know, those things.
But there's only something to say about someone.
Wine gets better with age. Like that's the type of like.
Sure, but there's something to be said about someone who's so hungry and they're at their peak of busyness.
I know.
And being sought after.
Correct.
That sparks a monster.
It does.
And that titan goes to sleep because you're no longer you no longer need to be at that sort of. You don't need to be that much of a killer anymore. But I'm not saying she's not a killer anymore. I'm just saying it's very interesting to me, that sort of mentality.
No, but like but talking from like percentage of sales and stuff, she was definitely at the
peaking.
peak.
Yeah. So you'd have like you have to mention Regine. So it's like, how do you put that into a medley? You have to mention Lea Salonga. She's kicking ass, late 90s, early 2000s, peak of her career essentially, right?
Yeah, I think
Disney.
So. Yeah.
Miss Saigon is what?
Late
90s, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to know the exact date. Who cares?
80s.
Your teachers are not watching. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Or maybe
good
late
point.
80s.
Yeah, I think it's early 90s,
Okay.
but again, I'm not a completely
When we
sure.
watched the rehearsal videos, it did say the date, but I can't remember now.
forgot.
So you'd have to, you're basically mentioning three big genres there: R&B, ballads, and that's the other thing. Is like it's not just Regine. I'm just saying Regine because it's obviously like one of the biggest names. But you have to mention so many people there. Like when it comes to like great altos from the Philippines, you'd have to mention Sharon. You'll have to mention Shasha Padilla. You like, and that's the other thing. Is like if you go like 50s to the 90s, you'd have to mention Pilita Corrales at some point.
Correct,
You know what I mean?
yes.
Then you will go with the lads. This is just females. Like you go with the lads. In the early 2000s, you have to mention Gary Valenciano. He's kicking ass late 90s.
Yeah.
90s to the early 2000s.
Well, he's kicking ass from the 80s. He's already been kicking butts from a whole decade.
Ogie Alcacid, you have to mention
Yes.
him if you're talking about 90s, early 2000s.
Well, and if you're talking pinnacle late 90s, early 2000s, freaking ballads and king, you have to mention Jano Gibbs as well.
Jano
in there. I mean, so there's a lot of pinnacle names that marked the industry and influenced it to be what it is today too.
And there are so many names we're not even mentioning, which is
I
ridiculous.
know. It's just from like the top of our heads.
And then obviously every year has Christmas, right? Which means every year has
Jose Marichan.
That's right. You know, so you have to mention him as well. But then when you go 2010s, you go to 2020, you have to mention the guys from X Battalion, right? They really revolutionized the
100%.
sound from 2010 to 2020, which they did, right? Pau Winako, fair enough. Then, well, that's not really them, but it's like OC Dogs, right? But like, you know, X Battalion, you have to mention OC Dogs. Obviously, you'd have to start mentioning the lads from like the revolution of the internet. You know, you have to mention Buddha Kale. You have to mention Cat Buddha. Was it Cat Buddha Kale? Is that when they...
Yeah.
I'll just say Katrina, right? You have to mention Katrina. You have to mention KZ. You have to mention Morissette. You have to mention... obviously, at this point, like if we're talking 2010 to 2020, you have to mention Moira de la Torre.
You have to mention SB19. They've taken the whole industry by the throat.
Yeah, you gotta the evolution again, right? So the sort of the industry is so cyclical, right? Back to groups, and now the huge uprise of people like you know Beanie, and you get the girls from there's this really impressive girls.
The girls are saying G22. The girls are saying
they're very impressive.
So good, and they're incredibly amazing live as well.
BGYO and a bunch of other names like Vision.
Yeah.
So you have to. It's so hard. Like it would be like hours upon hours long. But however, if you are interested in any of this, because I know people from all over the world watch, we probably have done a podcast in all of this.
Yes,
you know, like in different all these different genres. But above that, man, it's like what a fantastic fucking
Justin
video.
J killed it. By the way, I was just mesmerized by the whole vocal layering and like there's nothing harder than doing like a cappella or like compilations. Like my heart goes out to anyone that does this for a living out there, content creating. By the way, this is freaking hard, man.
Very conversation inducing.
Indeed, have fun.
So let us know what you guys thought about it, and maybe what names you think you have to mention per decade. Let us know in the comment section below, and thanks so much for watching.
Goodbye.